And it shall be, when the Lord thy God shall have brought thee out of the land which he sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give thee great and godly cities which thou buildest not, and houses full of all good things which thou fillest not, and wells digged which thou diggest not, vineyards and olive trees which thou plantest not. When thou shalt have eaten and be full, then beware lest thou forget the Lord, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Thou shalt fear the Lord thy God, and serve him, and thou shalt swear by his name. 25 years ago, when I was not much older than some of the people sitting on this side of the room, excluding the first two rows, I found myself in the Republic of Vietnam. And some events that went on in my life there in a very short time frame, and it was a time when you really had a hard time knowing which day of the week it is or what was happening, because night and day and days of the week all ran together. But on this particular day, as an infantryman, we were pulling road security on a road between a fire base Rollins and Tay Ninh City. And for an infantryman, road security was a house cat job. It was a time when you got your equipment together and you weren't out in the bush, and it was a relaxed type of atmosphere after you got the road secured. And so that morning we swept the road and we set up on the perimeter of the road to provide security for that road. One of the first people to go down the road after we swept the road was an elderly Vietnamese gentleman in an ox cart pulled by two water buffalo. And he went down the road into the far end of our sector, and I watched with amazement from my armored personnel carrier as he loaded what appeared to be a 48-inch pound circumference mahogany log into the back of an ox cart. With all of the grace and knowledge of physics, this small man loaded that mahogany log in the back of the ox cart with just his oxen, tilting the ox cart, using poles, sticks for levers. And in a short time, I noticed that he had completed that task, and he and his oxen were headed back in front of our sector. And I began to make sure other people were alert and checking the position, and had kind of lost contact that he had started back into our sector. And when that ox cart rolled right in front of our sector, a cheer went up among the GIs pulling road security along the road. And it was my surprise that this cheer went up, and it was a cheer like a ball game in which they were throwing their CVC helmets in the air and jumping on top of their personnel carriers, and they were cheering, "Hey, Papa San, the number one GI has landed on the moon." And there you were in the middle of a combat zone, and what had happened was these GIs had, during their stand down, got transistor radios from the PX, and they were listening as Walter Cronkite, through Armed Forces Radio, described that the Americans had landed and were walking on the moon. And it put me probably from there to the end of my tour in a mental state of the amazement of what you had seen there. And there were people that were very much more learned than I was, that would come to what I call educational or technical answers to what was going on. I was amazed that with the precision of a physicist, he had loaded that mahogany log. I could not comprehend with that same application that a man had landed on the moon. And the people around me that had this education would dismiss things, and they said, well, what I had seen was cultural lag. And that seemed to be a very, kind of a knowledgeable thing. They had heard that in some history class. What it seemed to me was the awesomeness of the God we serve. And as an unsaved Christian at the time who only knew of God, it was amazing to me that there was a God that had gave His Son for the salvation of a man in an ox cart, and would give His Son for the salvation of the man on the moon that He created. And I have 4 sons, and I love you all dearly, but I would not give any of my sons for your salvation. And as I grew and matured and older in my life, I began to understand the significance that times come when God puts things in front of you that are not something you can just dismiss with some book knowledge that you read in some book someplace, that something what you've seen was bigger than that. Later that evening, we set up our perimeter in a rice paddy, and we're there to spend the night there. And obviously, if you were spending the night in a rice paddy, most likely there would be some type of contact that evening. And I began to prepare the position and sort out the position, and I had asked a PFC Blaker to dismount his machine gun from the armored personnel carrier and put his machine gun on the ground and dig a hole in front of the machine gun so that he could climb in the hole. And I went along. It was a hot day. It was over 100. The mosquitoes were bad, and I went along to begin to check other people's positions. And I came back, and I got asked what my kids would later know as a private Blaker question. A private Blaker question is one in which the quality of the answer they're given is beneficial to the person that's answering the question. It's a question that sometimes I hear at home, like, how long should I study for this test? The benefit of studying for the test won't be mine. But Private Blaker asked me, said, "Sir, how deep should I dig this hole?" And I was amazed, and I could give Private Blaker no assurance that how deep he dug the hole, that he would be there in the morning. I knew that there would probably be contact that night, but I had no assurance that his ability to be alive the next day had anything to do with how deep he dug the hole, other than my best feeling was the deeper he dug the hole, the greater his chances were. And I, later in my life, thought that that's the way I was as a Christian, and probably some of you have been as a Christian, is that we know that if we accept the Lord Jesus Christ in our life, that we have a 100% chance for life eternity. But many of us walk around and ask the Private Blaker question, how deep must I dig the hole? And it's how much can I stay in the world, and how much can I walk with the Lord to try to accomplish this? That night, as I sat there in the perimeter in a distant fire base next to a mountain called Nui Ba Din, they were receiving mortar and rocket fire, and I could hear on the radio that what had happened was that someone had left the flag up that day, and that the VC were using the flagpole and the flag to adjust their artillery and rocket fire into the unit. And it made me think of Francis Scott Key in Fort McHenry, and how he had stood there and watched as they had shelled Fort McHenry and the American flag was still up. There was a common thing in Vietnam in those days that all GIs talked about, and that was called a drop. There were two ways you could get a drop. You could get a drop if something catastrophic happened, you got killed or wounded. That meant your tour got cut short and you got to go home. The other way you got a drop was a little more mysterious. The Department of Defense erred in your orders, and they issued you orders that allowed you to come home shorter than your tour. And there were always times when guys got a drop of 5 days or 10 days or 3 days or some imaginable amount. And you would see guys in their bunker inside their personnel carrier. They would have a calendar on the wall. And you'd say, but your tour isn't over here. And they'd say, yeah, but I'm going to get a drop. You know, I've knocked out these last 3 days, or I've knocked out this 5 days because I plan to get a drop. And it was after those events that I just described that they came to the field and they notified me that I had a drop and I was going home. And so I went to Tay Ninh Airport and I told them I've got orders here. I had very little things to bring with me. I need to go to Da Nang because I'm going home. And they said, well, there was no passenger service to Da Nang until in the morning, so there was no way I could leave Tay Ninh that evening. And I said, but you don't understand. I've got a drop and I can go home. I want to go home. And so he said there was a cargo plane leaving Tay Ninh. If I wanted to ride in the back of a cargo plane, he guessed I could go to Tay Ninh on this cargo plane. So I climbed in the back of this C-130 and sat in the back while they loaded their cargo. And to my surprise, the cargo they loaded were 25 body bags of other GIs who had a drop who were going home. And I sat there and thought about that situation, riding out of Tay Ninh, going to Da Nang, riding with 25 GIs all lined up with body bags with little tags on, giving their name and their number and information, going home to their families. And I began to think about who those 25 men might have been, or women. One might have been a nurse that had been there to serve, or one might have had a name like Salvatore or Rodriguez, or maybe there was somebody with a name like Goldstein, or maybe there was a black man from Detroit, and we had called black people Bloods, and it was an affectionate name that servicemen called each other in Vietnam, that black people were known, the black soldiers were known as Bloods. And I began to wonder, maybe one was an older sergeant that had spent years dedicating his life to service of the country, but this was his last tour and he was going home. And as I began to think about those people, I began to realize that in all of our differences, we had one thing in common. We were going home to America. We had got our drop, and we were going home. As I got to Da Nang, and they put you on a passenger plane, and you were off to San Francisco, I still could not get those men out of my mind, but what had changed was I began to search the question, what did they die for? What had they died for? What was the reason that had happened? And somewhere over the Pacific, it came to me that the question was not what had they died for, but what had I lived for? And I began to decide that I had lived so that I might speak out about what they had done and what they had sacrificed and what others had sacrificed. And I intended when I got home to do that. As we landed in San Francisco, and I had no baggage, but there were other GIs there who had brought artifacts from Vietnam, and they needed to go to the baggage department to pick up their baggage. There was a crowd there at the baggage thing, and they were chanting and yelling, and I really had been out of touch with what was going on, and I didn't realize what they were saying. But they were spitting on those GIs and calling them pig. And I wanted to go over there and say, look, do you know what these men had been through? But they were too loud and they were too boisterous. And so while I had decided on the plane that when I got home I was going to speak out, I clammed up and I didn't say anything. And I didn't say anything for 20 years because not only did I know I needed to speak out, but I didn't know what to say, what would be appropriate to say. And so as it was 5 years ago, this time of year, my son Christopher came to me and said that he was leaving high school a week early because he had enlisted in the Marines, and he was going into the Marine Corps. And at the same time, his grandfather was dying of cancer and was in the hospital and was in and out of consciousness depending on how much morphine he was under. And as we, 3 generations of service people, sat there in the hospital, his grandfather began to talk about the Bulge and about the invasion of Normandy and the things that he had been involved in World War II and the concentration camps and the people that he had seen. And in all of that discussion, it came back to me that it was time to speak out again. And as I began to think about it, the words sort of just flowed back in. And you've heard this before, but this is called Keep the Watch. And I've called it Keep the Watch because you have to prepare to keep the watch. You just don't go out and say, well, it's my watch tonight, I got to go out and stay on my watch. If you're going to keep the watch, you have to prepare to keep the watch. And we as Christians, if we're going to keep the watch, we have to do our preparation to keep the watch. But if you would bear with me just a short longer, this is called Keep the Watch. The bombs bursting in flight and the flag was still there. Not under a boastful way, but a glorious way, under God, letting the world know that these United States shall not become complicit to evil. For to do so would be to deny the redemptive blood of patriots past. From an outpost on Bunker Hill to Pork Chop Hill, from the beaches of Normandy and Omaha, from the jungles of Vietnam and Malaysia, the deserts of Africa and Iraq, and 100 other places like Somalia and Korea and Bosnia, brave young men and women left the playgrounds of America to serve a higher cause. They sought no land or territory. They installed no government or ideology. They ministered to the sick and dying. They housed the homeless. They liberated the oppressed. Many of those young men and women, sons and daughters, never returned to a playground in America. They left only their witness to the seed of David in Christian value. For their witness, God blessed America with amber waves of grain and snow-capped mountains and cities undimmed by human tears. But what if the blessing's gone? Who is keeping watch today As Christians, we're often seen as mere privates on a battlefield, crying out, "How long must I stand my watch?" Knowing full well that as Christians, we must stand our watch till the archangel sings and the trumpet sounds. Because God blessed America, we must stand to watch. You know, historians have long studied and researched the major documents and papers of this great country. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Monroe Doctrine, Lincoln at Gettysburg, Kennedy in Berlin, Martin Luther in Memphis. But in all that research and study, little attention has been given to a simple closing written by John Hancock in the Declaration of Independence. In that closing, he wrote, "We pledge our lives, our economic opportunity, and our sacred honor." Most of those men lost their lives. Many died in bankruptcy and as paupers. But today, over 200 years later, those men have still retained their sacred honor. You see, the men of that day believed that your sacred honor was something more than just your word given on the spur of the moment. But things done on your sacred honor were written in one of the great books of the Creator and brought out under the judgment and tested by the fire. As we as Christians had conducted our walk on our sacred honor, would our road to Calvary be so inundated with the artifacts of our own endeavor rather than the blessings of Christ? As we listen to a melody that is being played in the background, you know the song, you know the melody as the Star-Spangled Banner written by Francis Scott Key during the siege of Fort McHenry. But what you have forgotten and what you failed to teach to a generation of Americans is that Francis Scott Key wrote more than one verse to the national anthem, and we have failed to teach it to a generation of Americans. We, I believe, have failed to teach those verses to a generation of Americans because that national anthem calls attention to the fact that we put our trust in God in the second verse of that national anthem. And if we were to sing that today in our public schools, some judge somewhere in America would say that that verse could not be sung in a public school system in America. But today, in this celebration of those patriots, those true patriots who have served this country, let us stand and let us turn to 576 and let us sing both verses to that national anthem. And while you are singing, let's each of us decide in our hearts that we're going to rededicate ourselves to our walk in this country so that God in this country and the endeavors of this country, just like in Deuteronomy, walk together and share this experience together.
I'll stand up in a little bit. Is everybody sitting down? Don, sit down up there.